Howdy, folks. This is Miss Sinclair from Miss Sinclair's History. Today, we are continuing to talk about AP US history. We are currently in period 3, which looks at the Revolution. Today's the big day. Today, we are actually talking about the American Revolution. Now, you can watch this video with the PowerPoint slides on YouTube, or you can simply listen to the audio as a podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. This is the exact same lecture my students would be receiving in class. If you're a teacher who finds this helpful, I would ask you to consider checking out my Teachers Pay Teacher store, where you can find this PowerPoint, these same lecture notes, as well as activities and resources, many of them free. If you're a student, I hope this helps you be successful. Please ask questions if you have them. And if you're not a teacher or a student, I'm glad you're here. I hope you learned something new. But enough of me talking, let's jump into it. So, how did the Declaration of Independence reflect Enlightenment principles? Let's think about that a little bit. Well, of course, we know that the Declaration is a verbatim reflection of John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau talking about the social contract as well as natural rights. And all of these things contribute to an actual revolution. So you will be able to explain how various factors contributed to the American victory in the revolution. So if you are a student, or if you just want a little bit of review, I would love for you to pause right now and get out a piece of paper. Make a pro-con list for both the British and the colonies. Strengths and weaknesses. What are some of the advantages? What are some of the strengths that the British have? What are some of their weaknesses? What are some of the strengths that the colonists have? What are some of their weaknesses? Do a little bit of pre-thinking, activating that prior knowledge. What do you already know? Okay. Hopefully you're done with that. You were able to pause if you were working on it. Let's talk about it. So the revolution is going to start really before we actually have a Declaration of Independence, right? Lexington and Concord is before the Declaration is written or signed. So in June of 1776, right, prior to the Declaration, you start to have fighting. You have Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, as well as the Connecticut militia led by Benedict Arnold, surround and take Fort Ticonderoga. They use cannons from there to reinforce the siege of Boston, where you have, of course, the legendary Battle of Bunker Hill, where the colonists control the high ground. They're at the top of the hill, and the British are gunned down as they try and go up. The Brits will eventually be able to take Bunker Hill, be able to remove the colonial militia, but the result is heavy casualties. Many soldiers will die or be injured. So let's think about this sort of balance of power here. We see that the armed conflict has increased the debate within the Second Continental Congress, right? It's not abstract philosophical talks between John Dickinson and John Adams of like, what is the nature of man and government? Adams is from Massachusetts. He's from Boston. He is standing in the middle of the Second Continental Congress saying, those are my brothers, right? Those are my fellow Bostonians who are out there dying. And you want to talk about peace and reconciliation? So Dickinson and the loyalists, the more conservatives in the bunch, say, let's negotiate. Our Parliament and the king would obviously prefer peace over war, but the response to the Olive Branch petition was, of course, the British declaration that the colonies are in a state of rebellion and dispatch thousands of troops as well as ordering the closing of all colonial ports. For Adams, Franklin, Hancock, the pro-revolution people, this is a win, right? It sort of shows, look, the Brits don't want to negotiate. It's time for war. So what does this war look like? Well, the British have a lot of advantages. They have superior military power. They have more experience, more training. They have a navy and a trained army. They will offer freedom to any slaves who will join them to fight against the Americans. They have the ability to raise funds to buy more weapons to fund their military. This is going to be a huge challenge for the Americans. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of Americans were still loyalists, right? It was not that the vast majority of American colonists wanted revolution. There's 50,000 Americans who are still loyal to the king. Now, asterisk to all of this military might. Europe is constantly at war with itself. So George III and Parliament have to make that calculation. Is it wise to send our best and brightest? Is it wise to send the weight of the British military across the Atlantic Ocean to fight the Americans when you have France just across the English Channel, right? When you have Spain significantly closer? There's a risk. The more soldiers they send across the Atlantic means the fewer soldiers they have in Europe. They are leaving themselves vulnerable to attack from their European neighbors. Okay, what about American strengths? Well, the biggest ones were we knew the land. We are going to be able to maneuver more quickly, fight from positions of advantage, and frankly, we're more motivated, right? We are protecting our home, our family. George Washington's honestly a great advantage as well. He was the ideal leader for us in many ways. He's not the most brilliant guy in the room. He is not the guy who's reading John Locke and Rousseau, but he will surround himself with brilliant people. And he has a charisma about him that will draw people to him and make them intensely loyal, right? The number one example of this, of the brilliant people who will be advising him, will be Alexander Hamilton. So the war itself asks some questions, right? How legitimate is this new United States? Jefferson writes the Declaration, people sign it, it has nice language, blah, 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 blah. Okay. But just because your representative signed it doesn't mean it's the general will of the people, to borrow language from Rousseau. So what did most American colonists actually think? Well, 20% of the population was considered a loyalist, right? They were pro-English Tories. They tended to be educated, upper class, wealthy, cultured, cautious. The exception to this would be Virginia, where the money favored revolution. We're talking the Anglicans and Quakers in Pennsylvania and New York. So one of the challenges in the revolution is it will be very hard to tell who is pro-England and who is pro-America. We will see many of these people flee to Canada. As Americans grow more in favor of revolution, they will start to target their loyalist neighbors. About 100,000 will leave. The result is, because the British never properly utilize the loyalists, the people who are left the people who did not go to Canada will be more militant, more aggressive. The biggest group of people, not biggest group, a large group of people who will support the British Army will be slaves. Slaves were promised freedom if they helped. They didn't get it. So the question is, why didn't the British use the loyalists, right? Why didn't, there's so many of them. They have money. They are in positions of power and influence. Why not take advantage of this group of people within the enemy camp? The answer is the British didn't actually trust them. They didn't actually believe that they were loyal to the crown and never organized them, right? You had Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty and Thomas Paine. The revolution movement was very organized. A rebellion without organization is just a bunch of people complaining, right? There was no plan of like, here's who you talk to, here's what we're going to do, we're going to raise money for this, blah, blah, blah. Okay, what about the Patriots? They would be much more pro-Whig for thinking British political parties. They tend to be younger, poorer. If the Loyalists tended to be purely English in ethnic descent, the Patriots tended to be more Scottish and Irish, right? They're newer immigrants. They tended to be Congregationalist instead of Anglican. So the Anglican church has a hierarchical structure. So your local priest answers to a bishop, the bishop answers to the archbishop. Whereas in a Congregationalist model, the people of the church choose their pastor. The pastor answers to the people of the church, not to some higher authority. So the Patriots tended to be younger. They tended to be poorer, tended to be more energetic. They tended to be more spread out, whereas Loyalists tended to be clustered in big cities. John Adams, though, says that it would be unwise to, let me restart that whole statement. John Adams is going to say that about 1/3 of Americans wanted revolution. 1/3 of Americans was against revolution, and 1/3 of Americans didn't care. But this was probably not the case. It was probably 1/5 for war, 1/5 for the king, and 3/5 didn't care, right? Hamilton is quoted as saying, "Our countrymen have all the folly of the ass and all the passiveness of the sheep. They are determined not to be free. If we are saved, France and Spain must save us." Right? We tended to be summer soldiers and sunshine patriots, meaning that most Americans didn't really care one way or the other. And when we were winning, we were on board. And when we were losing, we weren't. So the British had a lot of advantages. They should have won. Logistically, they should have won. And the reason why we won was not because we were better than the British. It's going to be because of outside help. We've gone over some of these already, but they have a larger population to pull upon. They have more experience, training, better military, better trained leadership. And the American advantages were, of course, the home front, Washington, Hamilton, frankly, European allies, and war fatigue. The war fatigue is going to impact both of us, but the fact is the British had been fighting a lot of wars, and they were tired, and war was expensive. The musical Hamilton is not the most perfect musical in the world. There are a few historical liberties Lin-Manuel Miranda took when writing it, but overall, it does paint a fun picture of our sort of American founding fathers in some ways, including George Washington. If you haven't seen it or even listened to the soundtrack, I really would encourage you to do so. If nothing else, it provides a different way of remembering some of these facts. So if you can link some of this information to songs, then it will be easier for you to remember them on tests. So we need victories. We need an increase in morale. We need allies. We need France, frankly. Initially, in New England, George Washington, so GW, moves south. He is leaving Massachusetts and heading towards New York and New Jersey. Militias will help on each local level. There's some real challenges here. And poor George Washington has to keep not only the Continental Army united, but get support from Congress itself. You have to really understand, and I hope I can emphasize this enough, there is no United States at this time, right? If you were going to ask me, or most people I know, where are you from? I would say, oh, I'm from the US. I'm an American. I wouldn't say, oh, I'm an Arizonan or a Virginian or a Texan first and an American second. I'd probably say, oh, I'm an American first and a Texan second, or a Californian second. But that was not the case at this time. Each colony viewed themselves as an independent country. We're going to see this is going to become very problematic as we try to form a functional government. But the South felt like the North didn't understand their economy and concerns. And the North feel like, look, we gave you George Washington as leader of the Continental Army. Already we're seeing some real division culturally between the North and the South. So we keep losing, right? These are the times that try men's souls. We have tremendous losses in New Jersey. We see that we can't beat the British, but we can make sure they don't beat us. So we keep moving so we don't get caught, especially after the disastrous Battle of Long Island. George Washington gets caught on Long Island. He's trapped. General Howe, the British general, should have just swooped in and finished Washington off, eliminated the Continental Army. Easy peasy, the war is over, British win. But Howe is indecisive. He waits, and the British don't swoop in to finish off Washington. This was a bad mistake on all around. Washington stayed on an island when fighting a navy. Come on. But they will be able to escape. Washington is going to be able to keep the cause alive, right? He's going to really argue and articulate that we are not colonies anymore. We are Americans. We are together. And it's hard to keep an army going. Military historians will say wars are not won by strategy, they're won by logistics. So what's the difference? Strategy is things like the Trojan horse. We'll swoop in on their left flank. We'll lead the charge here, right? It's the moves you're going to do to attack your enemy. Logistics are all the things it takes to keep an army going. It's food, it's medicine, it's horses, it's uniforms. You could have the most perfect strategy in the world, but if your army is starving because you have not been able to get them food, or if half your army has deserted because you have not paid them, It doesn't matter how good your strategy is. You've lost because of your logistics. This is Washington and Hamilton's big challenge right here, is logistics. It's a long, cold winter. They don't have food. And yet, in the crossing of the Delaware, 2,400 men on Christmas night during a storm will cross the Delaware River, ice clogged, and they will attack the Hessian mercenaries that the British hired at daybreak. Already, Washington is sort of breaking norms, right? It was the unspoken military rule that you don't attack on Christmas, you don't attack on holidays, but he does, and we win. And it's a huge morale boost. If you get a chance, I'd recommend you watch or listen to the song Right Hand Man by Hamilton. Saratoga, the Battle of Saratoga acts as an effective turning point. General Howe has taken New York. General Burgoyne is coming down from Canada. The idea is to cut the colonies in half. John Burgoyne, Gentleman Johnny, as he was nicknamed, will sort of cut off the head. He'll meet up with Howe and cut off New England from the rest of the colonies, but it doesn't work. Burgoyne is charming. He's more of a politician than a fighter, right? You have to remember that British leadership in the army was typically just aristocratic, not necessarily trained. He was a poet, a gambler, a ladies' man, and an idiot in some ways. I mean, he didn't anticipate the terrain. One of the biggest differences between Europe and America at this time, and still to some extent today, Europe has been urbanized to a general extent since, gosh, you could make an argument since the Romans, right? There have been roads, there have been pathways, there are villages from place to place, right? You can travel relatively easily throughout Europe, even in the 18th century. So Burgoyne arrives and he knows it's going to be wild, but he doesn't fully understand. He's going through mountains that have no roads, right? They're going through forests, which means for them to move 3 feet, they have to cut down 3 trees and then clear out the rocks and the plants, right? They are making a road as they go, which is such slow going. It doesn't help that the Americans, aren't moving a giant army through, right? So we are fighting in a much more guerrilla warfare type way. And we start a new strategy where we target the military leader. So American soldiers hide in the trees and assassinate, essentially. They aim for the generals, for the officers, which goes against the rules of war. It appalled the British. How dare they? How dare they? So we win at Saratoga. Benedict Arnold is the hero of Saratoga. He fights off General Burgoyne and General Henry Clinton. Philip Schuyler, Horatio Gates, and Benedict Arnold are the leadership here, and Burgoyne ends up surrendering. The Battle of Saratoga is significant because it convinces France that they should side with the Americans. PBS came out with a series called Liberty, the American Revolution, several years ago. I would encourage you to watch the video clip from the Battle of Saratoga. You can find it linked on my YouTube page. There's a APUSH Unit 3 playlist that has all the videos that I reference. And it sort of illustrates the significance of Saratoga really well. So, what makes a revolution revolutionary? It seems like an easy question in some ways, right? What makes a revolution revolutionary? how would you define revolution? Not just, something revolves, right, and spins in a circle. But when we think revolution, we tend to think change, dramatic change. My argument to you is going to be that the American Revolution is not actually that revolutionary. Hold that thought while we continue on with our story. So, while Washington is fighting here in America, John Adams gets sent off to England to negotiate with King George III. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin are sent off to Paris to convince the French to support us. Franklin wears a coonskin hat. He speaks in American slang. He plays the part of the American. Jefferson speaks French fluently. He knows French wines and cheeses. Like, he impresses the French by how sophisticated he is. In either case, the French court loves Jefferson and Franklin. Yet that's not enough to convince Louis XVI that he should support the Americans. Like, you guys are great. I don't know why we should get involved in your fight. One of the things that we're going to see is that the French will join the fight against the British, primarily just to say, screw you to the British. It's not because they believe in the American Revolution. In fact, Louis XVI is an absolutist monarch. He is completely against the government system that the Americans will develop, right? He has no desire to follow the general will. He certainly does not believe that the power of government rests with the people. However, France and England are historic enemies. France just lost to England in the French and Indian War. If they can make the British crown, its life more difficult, sure, why not? Enemy of my enemy is my friend. So they will send over General Rochambeau and the Marquis de Lafayette to come to America and help us. They will send money, they will send supplies, food. The British Navy on the Atlantic will open up supply lines. So now the British have to fight on both land and sea. We didn't have a Navy. So the British Navy could just focus on controlling the coastline. Now they have a Navy they have to worry about. Marquis de Lafayette will actually be a huge asset. He is going to love the United States, and he's going to love George Washington. Washington and his wife Martha never actually had any children. And Lafayette will become to Washington like an adopted son. They will be extremely close. So with the Treaty of Alliance of 1778, we see that we are given resources by France. Now, an alliance with France is kind of tricky because France gets in fights with everyone else. So we don't necessarily want to be drawn into any European wars. So it's a commercial treaty as well as a treaty of alliance. We'll see that Spain will also join, offer support to the Americans for the same reason, mostly because they hate the British. Meanwhile, back in the United States, General Howe captures Philadelphia, and it's the long winter of Valley Forge. Supply lines collapse. Washington is desperately trying to keep the army alive. Literally, they are literally freezing to death. They are dying of smallpox and starvation. They are angry, they are deserting, And then resources from Europe arrive. Von Steuben re-energizes the army. He's from Prussia. He is a trained military officer. Everyone loves his energy. They love the resources he brings. He organizes and trains the Continental Army. Without von Steuben and Lafayette, we would have lost. Washington would not have been able to keep the army together. Let's look at a few quotes from soldiers who were in Valley Forge. It is very certain that half of the army is almost naked, in a great measure barefooted. Right? It's the middle of winter and you don't have shoes or coats. A number of our men, indeed all who have not had the smallpox, are and soon will be under inoculation. So you see that inoculation is like an early form of vaccination. So this inoculation would be to take some pus, essentially, from someone with smallpox and put it in a small wound of someone healthy. And so since they're healthy, their body will be able to fight off and build antibodies to the smallpox. So it's like an early vaccine mandate in 1778, before we were even a country under George Washington. Except that you have some dependents from abroad, the few horses that remain must perish in a few days. They resorted to eating their horses. We want, my dear sir, wine above all things, for our sick are now numerous and our cases generally putrid. We also want sheets, shirts, candles, soap, writing, as well as wrapping paper, pots, horn spoons, and every other kind of hospital utensil. They had nothing. So General Howe captures Philadelphia. You have the weakness of Valley Forge, and then you have von Steuben arriving to energize the army. How do Native Americans fit into all of this? Right? How do we prevent attacks from our native enemies while we're also attacking the British? It's not like the indigenous peoples were like, oh, I know you were invading our lands and forcing us out of our home, but like, I see you're busy. We'll just like pause on our disagreement until you're done. We see that different things will happen. One, the British had sided with the Native Americans in many instances, right? Think about the proclamation line of 1763. That line was designed to keep American colonists from moving west. It reserved that land for the indigenous peoples who lived there. So when the British move all their attention to the Americans, they stop defending the indigenous peoples. We see that in Georgia, without the British support, the American colonists will attack and really hit the Cherokee people very hard. The Iroquois make a calculated decision to try and ally with the British. They believe that the British was their best bet to preserving their land. They're not wrong in that respect, but because they allied with the British, when the Americans win, we will turn on them. We have no interest in an alliance or supporting them because we feel like you supported our enemy. We see that different tribes make different decisions. Some will side with the British, some will side with colonies. Okay, how do we pay for all this? Right? Wars are won by logistics. You remember why we went to war? What was our big battle cry? No taxation. No taxation. We went to war over taxes. Great. How do you think Americans would feel if suddenly taxes were raised because of the war? Not good. The answer is not good. We can't raise taxes to fund the army. First and foremost, we have no central government there's no federal government to tax all the colonies. So each individual state would have to raise taxes. Many states will just start to print paper money, which leads to crazy inflation. We will be forced to rely primarily on foreign loans. John Adams will get us a loan from the Dutch. Franklin and Jefferson will get us a loan from the French. People will buy bonds. So that's like investing in the government. So if I buy $100 in war bonds, right, at some point in the future, I will be able to exchange that $100 for $150. You're like loaning the government a little bit of money. You're investing in the government. And then you have continentals, the sort of the American form of money, which were worthless. Inflation was out of control. So the war ended up being decided in the South. The British resources were very thin by this point. We see that in Yorktown in 1781, General Cornwallis pushes himself onto a peninsula and ends up being trapped. He is besieged. The French bring in the French Navy to keep them from being rescued by the British. And at the Battle of Yorktown, the British are forced to surrender. They've lost. Well, yeah, they've lost. Americans want a peace treaty. The French don't. They want punitive, right? They're like, let's keep going. Let's, really kick the British while they're down. The Americans are like, no, this is good. This is good enough. So there's another good video from Liberty, the American Revolution on the Battle of Yorktown. I would also recommend watching the scene from Hamilton on the Battle of Yorktown. It's just fun. In the Treaty of Paris in 1783, John Jay, Ben Franklin, and John Adams negotiate with the British without the French, right? When they had signed the original treaty with France, they had said, yeah, you'll totally be at the negotiation table. We won't make any decisions without you. When push comes to shove, we make all of our decisions without them. But because of that, we won many concessions by going at it alone. We were able to play these European play these European enemies off each other. Well, if you don't give us this, I guess we'll go to France to get it, or we'll go to Spain to get it. Ultimately, the British thought that the Caribbean was going to be more important and lucrative than the American colonies, who were kind of annoying. So they didn't consider it a huge, huge loss. All of the territory to the Mississippi River went to Spain. We got some fishing off of Canada, but Great Britain says, we'll evacuate all of our troops except we're keeping our forts on the Mississippi. We have to be able to protect Canada. And the United States had to reimburse the loyalists. We say no, they say, great, we'll keep our troops in America until you do. The border with Florida is a little ambiguous, and we completely ignore Native Americans. So if you're going to look at a map, looking at pre-war boundaries and post-war boundaries, North America prior to the Declaration of Independence, so North America in 1775, you would see everything east of the Mississippi River and most of Canada around the Hudson Bay was controlled by the British. Everything else in North America was controlled by the Spanish. In 1783, if you were to look at a map, you would see the territory from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River now belongs to the United States. Everything west of the Mississippi and the Gulf Coast, including Florida, belongs to Spain. Canada around Hudson Bay still belongs to the British. So how does the American Revolution compare to any other revolutions you can think of? What other revolutions come to mind? You may think of the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, maybe even the Mexican Revolution or the Haitian Revolution, the Chinese, right? You might think of other revolutions. What's one key difference between all of those and the American revolutions? It's going to be the bloodshed and the instability. Here's my argument to you, is that, admittedly, this is my own interpretation, one I've heard other historians make as well. But you can certainly find enough historical evidence to argue otherwise. Hey, history is just interpretation. You support it with evidence, and you're good. Who really wanted the revolution in North America? Why didn't we see the same sort of instability in the United States that France will experience and Russia will experience and China, all of which had civil wars within like a decade of, within 2 years of the revolution happening? Why didn't the United States? Well, it's not because we're just better. It's because of who was pushing for the revolution. In all those other instances, Russia, China, France, Haiti, the lower classes, the poor, were the people pushing for revolution. So they wanted not only a change in government, but a change in the social hierarchy in the distribution of wealth. That's not what we saw in the United States. In the United States, we saw the upper class, the people with money, pushing for revolution. And the result was they got to keep their money, right? What changed in the United States for your average person? Very little. Slaves were still slaves. Women still had no rights. If you didn't own property as a white man, you still couldn't vote. Your legal rights changed almost not at all if you are an American living in the United States between 1775 and 1783. Except now you're an American instead of an Englishman. Neat. Okay. But because the upper class sort of pushed for a revolution to preserve their power, to preserve their social status and their wealth, we don't actually see anything revolutionary apart from our system of government. And we'll talk more about that system of government shortly. But it's just something to think about a little bit. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Was the American Revolution actually quite revolutionary? Tell me what you think. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you for listening. And I'm sorry, I realized I didn't do our summary. I would love for you to be able to explain how various factors contributed to the American victory in the Revolution. How do we win? Thanks, guys. Have a great day.